that there is a major attack underway by the Indian Navy on Karachi.
The government tried to present this fiction that Operation Sindhur is still ongoing.
If you looked at the way in which the media debated the issue, it seemed as though India was bashing the hell out of Pakistan at that point.
BJP-led government, the Modi government, was pursuing two narratives at the same time.
Welcome to Janashakti Network, Siddharth.
Thank you.
Founder, editor of The Wire 10 years ago. Momentous journey for you. But today what we would like to discuss with you is about over the last 10 years, the status of press freedom, and what are the kind of impediments to freedom that we have experienced over the 10, because I think that there has been a certain acceleration in the hindrances, the obstructions, the intimidation, and whatever. So my first, the first assessment I would like to get from you is, what do you make of the fact that, we are still apparently in Operation Sindhur, or the post-Operation Sindhur, first phase one of the first Operation Sindhur. In that situation, we have had India's topmost defense person in Singapore giving an interview to Reuters and Bloomberg about the kind of damage that Pakistan inflicted on India. Now, this is a bit odd because he has been facing these questions, or the Indian government has been facing these questions in India, but they chose not to answer the question in India, A, and B, they chose to do it to an international media, which is fine. Obviously the clarifications need to go out to the world. But what do you think this is? Is it because there seems to be a lack of confidence in Indian media, or is it something else?
I would say that this is symptomatic of a government that does not like to share information with its own people. Mm-hmm. And when I say own people, I don't mean because the CDS, the Chief of Defence Staff, spoke to Bloomberg or Reuters and not to an Indian outlet. Information travels, no matter who you give it to. But what they've been doing is withholding information, even pointing fingers at those who seek this information in some way. And this is a complete rupture and a break from previous practice, right? So any viewer who is confused and says, well, at a time of war, governments don't always part with information. India hasn't really ever withheld details of operational losses, for example. During Kargil, there were daily briefings, and information was not hidden from people as to what the true picture was. When India had setbacks, those were acknowledged. When Indian forces advanced, those were acknowledged. And
when there was a crisis on the fight front, then that too was acknowledged in past wars.
People had information. I wouldn't say not necessarily on a real-time basis, but what's odd here is that the 4-day conflict ends. The oddest thing, first of all, is that you have a ceasefire announced by President Trump. Right. So the declaration of hostilities comes from India, from an MOD, Ministry of Defense press release, and the declaration of ceasefire comes from Washington, which is a bit strange. But once 24 hours had passed and it was clear that the ceasefire was holding, the government tried to present this fiction that Operation Sindhur is still ongoing. when it clearly isn't. And, and that was then somehow used to justify not giving information that would supposedly demoralize the forces and so on. What I liked about General Chauhan's answer was not just that he was willing to acknowledge that there were losses. And, of course, the DG Air Ops at one of the press conferences after Sindhur ended, when asked a pointed question, did say that in combat there are losses. But he was a bit vague.
He was generalizing.
Yeah, he was generalizing, and but people took that to mean that obviously there was something that had happened. General Chauhan has been more forthcoming, not as forthcoming as he could have been. We still don't have information about the number of planes or the types of planes, or whether these were, and how they were brought down, how did they crash. But he spoke about the fact that there were losses, and what's more, he spoke about them as part of a learning process for the IAF, right? So he says on day one, certain tactics were followed.
And then there was a
rethink. And it took apparently 2 days for the Air Force to figure out what an optimal flying strategy would be. And then the Air Force was able to bounce back on the 10th, flying, dozens of planes, and by all accounts, going by at least the Government of India's claims and some satellite imagery that we've seen, striking a significant number of, targets in Pakistan, inflicting damage on air bases and so on. So, so he was speaking like a military person would, right? That, losses, you take losses on your chin, but you learn the lessons from them, right? And you then try to ensure that this doesn't repeat. And so he was speaking in that vein. Frankly, to me, I would have rather he gave more information and had done so earlier, and that too in India. But, I think it's important that he said what he said. It's significant. And it's a reminder that the question of losses in a conflict affecting the morale of somebody, it doesn't affect the morale of the services. They know that they've suffered losses, and their intention is to learn from that loss. But it clearly affects the morale of the politician who is trying to use the conflict and present a certain picture of the conflict with political motives and political gains in mind, right? So the fact that you have 5, if that's indeed the number eventually, but let's say an indeterminate number, say anywhere from 2 to 5 planes shot down, in the eyes, in the mind of Narendra Modi, this affects, or he assumes that this would affect how the public would perceive what he did. That you struck a couple of camps, 2 significant ones, apparently. I mean, 2 significant locations, Muridke and Bahawalpur, and lots of other places, 9 places in all. But if you lost 5 aircraft in the process, or 3 or 4 aircraft in the process, then people are going to ask, well, okay, how well planned was this? How well executed was it? Is it really going to serve the deterrent effect that you say? It opens up a can of worms, right? It opens up a debate. And people then begin questioning whether you, Prime Minister Modi, have thought this through. So I can understand why for Mr. Modi that would be a morale issue.
Let me ask a different question, Siddharth, which is that, if you looked at the way in which the media debated the issue, it seemed as though India was bashing the hell out of Pakistan at that point. And it was doing so with a kind of invincible shield, which kind of suggests what you said, which is that the morale of whose morale are we talking about?
Yeah.
Whose prestige or whose reputation are we talking about? Now, if you look at the way in which the media has functioned over the Pahalgam issue, it's been a kind of everybody who's not in line, towing a line of whatever is the current dispensation's position, which is Mr. Modi and his well, Mr. Modi hasn't said much about Pahalgam to begin with, which is again a bit of a surprise. But if you look at the way in which it was the whole narrative has been shaped, then you also find that the media followed up with even greater energy and enthusiasm. They set up their war rooms well in advance of what happened. So, how do you see this?
So there's a reason for what you are what you have rightly observed. I think the government, or rather the BJP, or the BJP-led government, the Modi government, was pursuing two narratives at the same time.
Okay.
There was the official government narrative, which was contained in the Ministry of Defence press release on the first day, and was expounded on by the Foreign Secretary every evening in his press conferences, and by the two officers who were representing the army, Colonel Qureshi and Captain Vyomika Singh from the Air Force. And that official narrative was that this is a very limited action India has taken. Targets have been selected to ensure that there is no escalation, and that India hopes that this action that India has that the Indian forces have taken will not lead Pakistan to escalate. And the Indian defense release mentioned that neither civilian nor defense targets were hit, only targets linked to terrorist groups. That's the official message, right? Limited, non-escalatory, designed to ensure that there is no war. The unofficial narrative, the political narrative, was the opposite. So just like the government officially went out of its way to say, we're not escalating, we don't want a war, the media narrative, the political narrative, was pushing this idea that India, even though on the ground nothing was happening, but they were selling this idea that the government is on the verge of destroying Pakistan.
That's right.
Right? And this frenzy, by the time it entered the third day, was completely out of control. So you had, TV channels breaking news about how the Indian aircraft carrier has destroyed Karachi port. Indian soldiers have entered Pakistan. Rawalpindi has fallen. All kinds of crazy things were being said by these channels. And, it wasn't just one reporter out in the field who was being misinformed, right? And passing on that misinformation.
No, this was happening in studios.
These were the lead anchors, the defense correspondent. India Today fielded its chief defense correspondent for a conversation on this Karachi business. And, so it's clear that, and if you look at the fact that 6-7 channels were doing the same thing, there was some kind of I think, political signaling emanating maybe from the Prime Minister's office or from the BJP, saying, let's try to push this narrative, the political narrative, that, how Modi is hammering Pakistan and, the end of Pakistan is near, which was completely at odds with the official story. And that also tells you or explains to you why, in sort of public opinion and particularly right-wing circles, the ceasefire led to a huge meltdown, right? So because you've pushed this narrative that India is on the verge of destroying Pakistan, and I want to underline again, the government had no intention of doing anything of that kind, and the Indian army has no intention of doing that. But the political narrative is being pushed, and then suddenly you have Uncle Trump declaring a ceasefire, right? And so, these guys are saying, God, what happened?
And then linking it to trade.
And then, of course, you had Trump, embellishing, spinning. We don't know, even now, we don't know what the truth is, quite frankly. But, this is a classic case of the BJP overhyping, or any political party overhyping
the ruling party.
The ruling party pushing a narrative and then basically getting overwhelmed by that narrative. So you created expectations, and then finally your own sort of your own loyal journalists were having meltdowns in their studio that how could this happen? How could India accept a ceasefire? How could Trump get involved? Whereas, the ceasefire was, I think, very much in India's interest, because India, right from day one, said we have no intention of escalating, and the idea is to simply, go after certain terror targets, create a disincentive in the Pakistani official mind that you can get away with shielding these kinds of groups and not pay a price. So the MOD and the Indian military are quite satisfied, but those guys who thought India was on the verge of destroying Pakistan are clearly not, right?
Okay. One of the things that comes across very strongly in what you said, Siddharth, is that truth has been the victim, as it were, in this entire game as it has played itself out on media and between media and the government. Truth was not yet come out on what happened, and because you began by explaining it that way. So what it really points to is that the media somehow is failing in its job.
So that's a important question and an observation. One caveat: at a time of war, right? And
No, even
I know. I'm just saying. That's why I'm putting this caveat, right? That at a time of war, and we did have 4 days of war. It's hard to expect the government to be sharing information, and it's hard to expect the media to really be in a kind of hyper questioning mode, right? You don't have generally at wartime.
do, actually.
No, I mean not. See, it depends on some kinds of issues, right? But the in India we have no tradition of that. Like if you go back to Kargil, for example.
If you go back to 71.
No, 71 perhaps because it was there was a long drawn out, there was a long build up. There were discussions in the media about how should India react, etc., etc. Should India be arming Mukti Bahini? But if you look at the last 2, right? So Kargil and this, and I was a journalist during Kargil, so that's more fresh in my memory. 71 is kind of a bit before my time, and
I remember 71 vividly.
yeah, okay, the media coverage, yeah.
Yeah.
Wow. Okay, so for me, Kargil was the defining media war, and they had. I mean, what I do recall is that the Vajpayee government was much more forthcoming with information. So there was much greater and structured information flow. There was some spinning. There was some attempt to overplay things, but by and large, I think that in terms of providing access, allowing soldiers to go up to the front, that was a new.
They did allow reporters to go. There were embedded journalists in there.
And so this was not that kind of a conflict because this is kind of air battle really. But I would say, for a media, I mean, I think future historians will ask themselves, why did the Indian media do so badly? And the answer to that lies with their performance in the last 11 years, right?
Yeah.
Or even earlier, perhaps.
Yeah.
Going back longer. So, if you're not used to asking questions and being critical and being independent in peacetime, how on earth are you going to be critical
in war
and asking questions at war, right?
Yeah.
So, in fact, the best that we can hope for at wartime is that, okay, you just take dictation, right? Because you take dictation at peacetime anyway, so just stick to taking dictation. But these Godi channels, they were not just doing dictation, right? They were making up stuff.
And they were feeding hysteria, which is the last thing that a government ever wants.
And I would say not just hysteria, Shikha. The problem is that, there was a lot of hysteria, and I recall meeting people in my colony in Delhi, where there was a young Bengali man who came to me and said, "Look, Dada, you are a journalist. My mother is watching the news in Bengal, and she's saying you just come home right now, because Delhi mein khatra hai," right? So there was hysteria that was being spread. But I think more than hysteria, and I think this is what should alarm us, and we should really be asking the government very tough questions on this. You allow channels for 24 to 48 hours to spread disinformation about the conflict, right? So when you put out a story that Indian troops have entered Pakistani territory, when you put out a story that the Indian Navy has destroyed Karachi port, and you run that for hours, you're creating an excuse for the other side to escalate, right? Because, they can always say, like, let's say a Pakistani missile is then launched on Bombay Harbor, and India says, look, why, it goes and tells the world that, Pakistan has targeted a civilian port, and the Pakistanis will turn around and say, well, no, your media has been reporting about Karachi, right? So I'm saying, even if it's, I mean, militaries are more disciplined than, doing that kind of thing, but you're creating uncertainty and risk for your own folks, for your own military, right? And, to my mind, that's unforgivable. Like, why would you want to allow that kind of fake news to spread?
Okay, so what you're saying is, and I think that's a very important point that you've raised, which is that fake news, when it was coming out of these national channels, as it were, that should have been countered strongly by the government. The denials or they should have been called out at that point, and that didn't happen. So you are essentially saying that the government or the ruling dispensation wanted that narrative to be.
It's. I think, as I said, there were. The Modi government ran this with two agendas in mind, right? So one was the narrow official, correct diplomatic military agenda, and the other was the blatantly political one. And I think that whoever was doing this blatantly political agenda clearly was very high up in the food chain, because to my mind, the minute one channel, let alone six, starts saying that the Vikrant has leveled and destroyed Karachi port, there should have been a statement from the information ministry, from the army, saying this is nonsense.
Yes.
Particularly when your message to the whole world is that we are not escalating, right? So why was there no denial? And you have, there were lots, and this is the same government and information ministry that was very quick, and rightly so, with denials on day one. If you recall, like, I was woken up at 2:45 at night, or 1:45, 2:45 maybe, by my correspondent, one of my reporters, who said this started. Sindhur, I mean, the attack has started. So I woke, and then I stayed up the whole morning and, the whole day actually. And there were all kinds of claims emanating from Pakistan from around 5 or 6 in the morning. That that planes had been shot down. Yeah, I started seeing a pattern to it around 3, maybe 4 o'clock, and then you would see photographs emerging of a burning plane. It's very hard to tell what is that footage, right? But if you use the kind of forensic tools that you can, on the internet, and you can do reverse image searches and so on, so it's quite easy to debunk some of these things. And so we were doing it at our level. I remember tweeting in a couple of instances. Zubair Ahmed of Alt News was very active that night, and so was the government of India. Right? So PIB was pointing out which images were fake and so on. So if you could be fast in countering that kind of bogus information emanating from Pakistan, information that India has destroyed Karachi port
Should also
have been countered, right? So if and incidentally, to this day, the government of India has not said anything about this. No. In fact, Ashwini Vaishnav, who's the information and broadcasting minister, I saw a bite of his, I think 48 hours after the ceasefire was announced, thanking the media channels, TV channels, for the work they did. So does this mean that you encourage the dissemination of fake news? We know that you do it at other times, but to do so at wartime, and I want to underline this, that you're putting out fake news about combat operations, real or fictitious, at a time of actual conflict, creates uncertainty. It creates instability in the information space that the enemy can take advantage of.
Well, quite apart from what the enemy can take advantage of, there is a domestic audience which had the right to be factually informed.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah.
And that it's almost as though there was a domestic audience which was being fed a kind of information that would make them go that would get them on the streets and wave flags and sort of say, you know, this is how we need to respond. So basically, there was that political agenda that you were talking about. Now, just to get on to some other stuff, you know, Pahalgam, yes, but at other points in time, over the years, what we have seen is that the social media is, instead of alternate media, you have the social media which is emerging as the basic alternative to the media itself. So you have you have professional organizations that employ professionals like The Wire or others. Um, and there are organizations which seem to be run by whoever there is, maybe the BJP, maybe Amit Malviya, maybe somebody else. And you have all of them emerging as the alternative. Now, this alternative is something that we need to sort of separate the chaff from the wheat, as it were. And the role of the other alternative, the non-professional, agenda-driven alternative, now, how do you see that as sort of making this the whole idea of the freedom of the press or the freedom of the media, jeopardizing it to the extent that, you know, we don't know the difference between fact and fiction anymore?
I think there is a problem with you know, quality, quote unquote, right, across the board. As you say,
But you know, Siddharth, let me say about quality.
Yeah.
We all know that, you know, there are different audiences for different kinds of quality.
Yeah. But I'm saying in terms of you know, the broad, in terms of the kind of rules of the road, tradecraft that a platform follows. So if I were to paint a picture of the current media landscape, so you have legacy media, which are your newspapers mainly, and your television channels, which have existed, you know, from before the internet. A couple of channels have come up in the digital era, like Republic or perhaps Times Now. But you know, so that's your legacy media. Then you have digital platforms, digital only platforms. The Wire is one of them. There's Scroll, there's News Minute, News Laundry. Lots of First Post was the oldest one, now owned by the Reliance Group, and then you have social media, which is not exactly. I mean, I would divide social media into two. One part of social media is simply, you know, ordinary people sharing, writing, commenting. I wouldn't count that as media or news necessarily. Although sometimes
I don't know whether they're so ordinary.
No, I'm saying no. Let's take it as I mean, sort of non-journalists, okay, who are doing this, and then you have a new trend, quite a positive trend, of experienced journalists who have left legacy platforms, Ravish Kumar, for example, and who have set up their own YouTube channel and their own social media sort of presence, and who function in a professional fashion, right? So these have all become sources of information, sources of circulation. Social media helps to circulate, you know, and I would still say that the bulk of what gets shared and you know, what circulates is content put out by professional media organizations in the main. And you have and we've seen this over the last 2 or 3 years, that as a major chunk of legacy media has gotten completely discredited in the eyes of ordinary people, right? What we call the Godi media, right? People can see that these channels are just putting out government propaganda, and so if you know, they stopped watching. I don't think young people tune into television anymore. People share the odd video and so on, but they don't switch on the TV set and watch Republic TV or whatever.
Everybody is watching on the phones or laptops.
Exactly, right? And so what we've seen over the last couple of years is the rise of a pro-government digital media. Media, quote unquote. I would say pro-government digital platforms that mimic and masquerade the structure of a news report or a news platform, but are essentially peddling propaganda primarily aimed against the BJP, the BJP's opposition and civil society, anybody who's critical of the government. You would have a kind of a hit job being run in some of these platforms. So, question is, what's the impact? I would say that in a large and diverse country like ours, it's not difficult for all kinds of content to find takers, right? And there's frankly nothing much you can do about it. I am quite happy to have all of these platforms slug it out among themselves, and they will all find their level. And I think readers, responsible citizens, will gravitate towards reliable sources of information, and that explains why platforms like ours, or there's we are part of DigiPub, which is a digital publishers network. More than 100 plus members in all languages, and these are all young, small startups, very little resources, have a huge reach because people can recognize that here are a bunch of people, could be in Bengali, Odia, Hindi, Malayalam, who are catering to the need of society, the need of citizens for authentic information. Some of them may be very niche, looking at environment or women or politics, but they're doing a professional job. Legacy media, I would say newspapers still have takers, and some papers still continue to do pretty robust job. TV channels are all finished as a source of news and reporting, quite frankly. But I would say the rise of digital and the fact that the Modi government, wants to throttle digital, like they want to come up with new rules, new regulations to somehow constrict what we are able to do. This itself tells you that the work that we do has takers, and the government doesn't like that. Government doesn't like the fact that we have a reach, and it's doing its best to curb that reach. Sometimes by blocking, sometimes by putting pressure on X, for example, to withhold, to block certain Twitter handles, get a video taken down by YouTube. So this is proof positive that the government knows there is a large, vibrant ecosystem of independent media that's not that easy to control. And so we are here, and despite all of the noise and of these Godi channels and fake news providers and some of these pro-government websites that try to mimic news, what a news platform does, I think the reader and the citizen at large has a pretty good idea of what they need to read and follow.
And Siddharth, this is a question that I am interested in. Because I'm sitting in Kolkata, you're sitting in Kolkata. Is it the regional so-called independent media on the digital platform? They seem to be actually reaching out to a lot of people in a lot of ways. So you're getting this alternative.
Absolutely.
I think that's the most,
and particularly video, right? And it's sort of so these are guys who are shooting content and putting it out. Not all of it is very well made, but it's authentic. It's and of course, here again you have, I'm sure, the good and the bad. Some are more professional than others. Some cut corners. Some are just doing it to get views, and they're not really committed to telling a story the way it should be told. So there's all kinds. But the fact is that digital technology has enabled and empowered journalists across the country to work and to provide information, to do stories on a very low budget, and if they're successful, they can even make some money through their video platforms and so on. So I think that this is something which the Modi government doesn't like, and I think one of the reasons why you see stories from time to time, right, of a YouTuber being arrested, or some channel in Kashmir having its Twitter handle blocked. The idea is to put pressure. 4 p.m. Important YouTube channel coming out of Lucknow. The YouTube took them down for I think 2 or 3 weeks on government order. So the idea is to introduce an element of uncertainty to remind digital journalists that look, you may think that you're very free and independent to do what you want, but we can come after you if you want to, right? That's the message the government wants to send. And they hope that that will be a deterrent. So far, I don't think it's worked, because if anything, there is even greater vibrancy in the independent media space today than there was 5 years ago.
Yeah, because there are lots of young people
Exactly.
who are sort of coming in
Exactly.
and doing their
Exactly.
own thing. Now, you know, when we talk about this intimidation, whether you shut the people down, or you block their Twitter handles, or you arrest somebody, or you harass somebody, the fact is that the number of deaths of young journalists has gone up. And we seem to be seeing a violence against personal attacks on journalists increasing over this last 10-15 years. Now, that do you think that has worked as a deterrent, or has that been an incentive to all of us?
I think the physical threat is more acute in certain places, Kashmir, Chhattisgarh at one time, in the northeast. Also, local reporters dealing with local well-connected mafias. People working on right to information stories. Exactly, right? So they tend to um, be more at the sort of front line of risk. Uh, what most reporters face across the country is not so much the threat of physical violence, although that's an ever-present threat, but of intimidation through the threat of cases. So one of the biggest obstacles for young reporters, particularly freelance ones, is that when you're working on a story, you don't know if what you file, if it appears somewhere, and if it hurts some vested interest, whether that's going to end up in an FIR being filed against you. The reporter in Uttar Pradesh who did a story on children in Mirzapur being given roti and salt for midday meals, right, could never have imagined when he filed the story that there would be a criminal case against him. Yet he was arrested, right? And there are lots of other examples. And in Kashmir, it's quite routine for journalists who do critical stories to be summoned to the thana for days on end and asked, why did you do the story? Who are your sources? Give us your devices. So this kind of intimidation, the filing of cases, has sadly become much more. I would say this is a new thing. Back in the day, defamation was the worst that you could imagine. If you did a story that annoyed somebody, so they could drag you through the courts on a civil defamation or criminal defamation case. These cases are cases, well, UAP in the extreme level. So Prabir Purkast, for example, or Fahad Shah, Sajjad Gul, these are some of the names, Siddiq Kappan. But the sort of regular criminal cases. So the government in UP, for example, police have used hate speech laws to go after reporters who are covering hate speech, right? So it's a kind of double whammy, and so this is the threat, I think, of what we could call lawfare, right? The danger of being ensnared in legal battles that will take up months or years of your life. Weaponization of law, exactly, against reporters. That's, I think, that's one of the major challenges of our time. And secondly, the new rules and regulations that the Modi government is trying to devise. They already came up with a set of rules over the last 3 or 4 years, the IT rules. Parts of it have been stayed or struck down, like the mandatory fact checking units, that this government fact checking unit could somehow declare a certain news item fake, and then you have to delete it, right? So that's been struck down. But
also the kind of blanket provision that they've created for something that is anti-national. How do you define it?
I mean, these are all undefined. Sadly, we are seeing increasing resort by the government to the quote unquote anti-national provisions of the IT Act. For example, Caravan magazine did a story on the killing of civilians by the army in, I think it was Pooch, in December 2023. And the story was widely reported. They did a detailed story a couple of weeks later. You can still buy the magazine. But the digital version of that article, the government said they banned it, citing national security. Caravan's gone to court. We are going to court because they blocked our site because we ran a story we ran a story about CNN quoting French officials confirming that India lost a Rafale.
Yes.
And so they wanted that story taken down. So we've gone to court on that. And these are all, this is the invocation of national security, public order, completely bogus in my view. Well, hate speech they haven't yet used for takedown. For taking down, but yeah, like this is the direction the government is going to go on. I think, which is all part of the weaponization of law. So where the IT Act suffices, they will use that. Where they feel they want new rules for the IT Act, they will introduce those rules. Where they feel the IPC or the BNS can be invoked. Like look at the case against. He's not a journalist, Ali Khan Mahmoodabad, but it was a Facebook post that anybody could have written, and the kind of provisions that they've invoked, including the BNS version of sedition. So we are in a situation where the government is showing greater and greater intolerance towards criticism and dissent of any kind. And once the government goes in that direction, and unless the courts are going to be there firmly in defense of the Constitution, you are going to see more cases of harassment, arrest, detention, and worse of journalists, but I would say of people in general who are exercising their constitutional right to free speech.
So, quite apart from the media, we are obviously now required to evaluate the kind of risk that we have to take in order to function. Either we function, well, some of us will have to evaluate the risk. Others who are in what we are describing as Godi media or the media that serves the political agenda. There is a risk, and then there are the freelancers who are at even greater risk because they have less. Are you saying that they have less? They have less resources?
Yeah, I mean the freelancer, freelancer doesn't have an institution to back her, right? And so she, if she does a story for a news platform, one would hope that the news platform, in the event of a case being filed, would stand by her, by the freelancer, and not just defend itself. Although one has heard of examples of, I know a couple of cases of magazines that have abandoned, even newspapers that have abandoned, freelancers and even former staffers who did a story and then have left the organization. But the main thing is that, if you're part of an organization, then there's a certain comfort that comes with being, you're part of, you have colleagues, there's a structure, and there's a certain expectation that your platform is going to back you and stand by you. In the case of freelancers, it's you're on your own pretty much, right? And even if most platforms are ethical enough to stand by you once you do a story, and if that attracts a case, what do you do about the problem of self-censorship? Because the whole idea is to actually the chilling effect, right? The arrest of the reporter who did the Mirzapur story, or the arrest of other freelancers. The idea is to put the fear of God into freelancers that don't even, because today freelancers are the eyes of the country in
the corners
in the corners that big media is not present, and they're not present in most places, right? So what's the best way to ensure that you don't get a report from Banda or from Abujmar or from Dhenkanal is to basically pick up the odd, and you just have to pick up one or two cases is enough to send a chilling effect. And I think so. The ad hoc, random, bizarre nature of the cases that we see can only be explained by the fact that what the government wants to do, and is pretty confident it can get away with this, is that you have a chilling effect. You arrest one, deter 1,000. Right? That's the idea. And so freelancers are, I would say, a vulnerable group.
So what we are now looking at, therefore, to sort of wrap it up, is A, truth is a casualty. B, there is Uh, there is a whole, there is a structured approach to how the truth, those who want looking for the truth, can be warned off from finding the truth or sharing the truth as they know it. In other words, the sort of freedom of the media, or the freedom to even think, or the right to know, all of this is therefore being what, jeopardized?
I think all
How would you
yeah, I would say all stages of the citizens' right to information are being attacked, right? So the first stage, which is the right of people to put questions to government and get information. We've seen amendments to the RTI. We've seen ministries, government departments not entertaining journalist questions. So there's a
We've seen Parliament not answer.
Parliament not answering questions. MPs submit questions which are then disallowed by the on spurious grounds. So
Or they are all given in writing. The answers are given
and
in
they and they're given and a very generic answers that don't answer anything, right? So you don't allow information to be gathered. You put a stop or you discourage the writing of a story. You discourage the publication. You have tools to threaten public. So in other words, publications or TV channels that feel like look what happened NDTV, right?
Siddharth, let me just, because I'm hearing this more and more from younger reporters, that when you go to the government and ask for a comment, either a denial or you give us some details, whatever it is, that kind of our need to verify has been blocked.
It's been blocked and weaponized against you, right? So when you don't get an answer, right, the presumption then is that you do the story, I'll see you in court, right? And often the threat is given by so it becomes very hard for a freelancer who's getting stonewalled when they want to give a fair chance to somebody who's going to be in who you're reporting against to give their point of view, and they don't cooperate. The PMO doesn't have anybody. The Prime Minister's office does not entertain questions and give responses, except in very, very, for the Pegasus story, we were able to get it. They were able to push our response to the INB and get a reply from there, but that's about it. So you basically make it hard to gather information. You make it hard to write a story. Publications and platforms feel vulnerable that if they run certain kinds of stories, will they come into the government's bad books, and will attempts be made to target them in some way? NDTV is a very good example of a channel that basically was, its ownership changed and the whole nature of the channel changed.
Well, that's a subject that we didn't touch upon,
and finally, once the story is published, the government is attacking the means of distribution, right? Because what's the point of a story if it doesn't get shared and doesn't get read, right? So you discourage people from sharing it. Discourage, in extreme cases, you lean on YouTube or X to delete a certain tweet or a video, right? So they are operating at every level to ensure that the flow of information is only as per what they want and what they like. And our response has to be that we are not going to give in. And our response, there's enough of us to, and there's lots of collaboration happening across digital platforms. And I would say that over the last 10 years, journalist unions, press clubs have become more active. So I think, I'm not despondent. When I look at the state of big media, and it's horrible. But forget the big media, forget the sort of monopoly media, the kind of established legacy media. You have a thriving, vibrant, alternative, independent media that's not small. It's not insignificant. It has influence. And what's more, you have lots of journalists who are, even journalists who work in these big media organizations, who still stand by and value, the values that you and I, that you and I do. and who are trying to fight the good fight within very difficult constraints. And then you have the press clubs, the unions, Editors Guild has gotten very active. So I would say, all told, there is a good fight on our hands. The government is trying its best to suppress, and we are doing our best to exist and to fight and to survive. And I would say right now, I think the odds favor us. I think we will be here longer than the current government.
That goes without saying.
Yeah, exactly. And so we will outlive this pressure, and we will be there to deal with and to monitor and to shine a light on whoever comes next.
On this happy note, thank you, Siddharth.
Thank you.
Don't forget to like, share and subscribe to stay updated with the latest incidents. Hit the bell icon to never miss an update. We will see you next time with more news that matters. Stay informed, stay safe.